Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak on a topic that's very dear to my heart. I know yesterday was Veterans Day officially, but veterans issues and the ongoing wars are things that I think about every day of the year. So, I also want to take a moment to recognize that there's a lot of people here who work very closely with veterans besides myself, and there are people here who may be yourselves veterans. So I wanted to take a moment to just acknowledge your presence here and your perspective, because it can be a little strange getting into a situation where I'm talking to you about yourself, but let me tell you about yourself. So I want to just acknowledge that from the outset. And my experience working with veterans is that they have a pretty good BS meter, so I don't really need to tell you if you hear it, call it out. One of the things that I am most sensitive to and I'm concerned about is getting lost in academic jargon and speaking about veterans issues in a way that a lot of veterans themselves may think, like, what is she even talking about? So I would like your feedback on that, actually. This is a work in progress. This is a paper I'm going to give in March, and it's built upon previous work that Dr. Edwards has mentioned. So with that preface, I'll take it away, and I'd like to start with a quotation. In the recent column on war, guilt, and thank you for your service, West Point professor of English Elizabeth Samet argues that the ritual of thanking troops for their service is, quote, a poor substitute for something more difficult and painful, a conversation about what war does to the people who serve and the people who don't, end quote. That conversation is sometimes initiated unsuccessfully on campuses and in our communities when civilians, out of curiosity or ignorance or concern, have the desire to ask a veteran, so did you see any action? Or, hey, what was it like over there? Or the lesser spoken, I would hope, did you ever kill anyone? And I know a number of veterans who've been asked that question. To many veterans, such questions may smack of a kind of voyeurism, or may seem like foolish questions. In the kindly words of former Marine and professor of English Galen Leonhardy, asking a person whether he or she has killed another person does seem to push the limits of propriety. Yet action, killing, and combat is a truth of war. It is as undeniable as it is ineffable, that is overwhelming, seemingly beyond words. How do you describe such a thing? Faced with the moral realities of what some now call permanent war. We used to say it's been more than a decade of war, and now you can say, well, it seems like we may have what we think of as permanent war. And with serious stumbling blocks to the kind of conversation that Samet calls for, how many of us, veterans and civilians, turn off, tune out, go numb? So you see a lot of attention to veterans issues on Veterans Day, and then throughout the year, that attention sort of waxes and wanes. Or you have a situation, if you just imagine this scene of watching the news, say, with your father-in-law, and this is an example from my experience, where it's PBS News, it's academic family, and at the end of the broadcast, there's the faces of all the troops who've been killed, and at that moment, he gets up and turns off the TV, walks out. Because of my work, I always sit there and look at those faces. But that's what I mean when I say turn off and tune out and go numb. How do we even work through these issues? And I also like to ask in that moment, who has the privilege of turning off that TV, so to speak? So in this essay, I argue that veterans' self-sponsored writing and visual compositions offer a way to reconnect. I first review one example of such representation, and this is Iraq veteran Zach Skiles' new feature-length documentary on killing, which takes as its central organizing feature dialectical engagement with an academic text. So it's of interest to those in higher education because Skiles is doing what we ask students to do and what we like to do in higher ed, which is engage dialectically with another author and text. But he's not doing it for academic purposes. It's self-sponsored, extracurricular, so to speak, composition. So I review this documentary and I then address some implications of this sort of veteran self-representation for those working with veterans in higher ed, many of us here, I would say all of us here, particularly in college writing classes, so my fellow English folks. I contend that academics must be able to work deftly with some specific ideological tensions, and by that I mean differences in beliefs and values, that veterans' writing can make poignant and pressing. And I suggest that a rhetoric of witnessing, this comes from Kelly Oliver's notion of witnessing, she's a philosopher, feminist philosopher, may be especially useful for doing so. So again, I draw that rhetoric from Kelly Oliver, from Iraq veterans' creative writing, and from my own work as a civilian workshop facilitator with the National Warrior Writers Project. It's a national nonprofit out of Philadelphia, but we do work sort of nationwide, major cities nationwide. So that's where I'm coming from, and first I want to review this documentary for you to sort of lay out a context for some of the issues we're going to talk about, or I'm going to talk about. So the documentary is called On Killing by Zach Skiles, and it's a playlist of 8 videos available on YouTube, each of which is 9 to 12 minutes long and has been viewed anywhere from 126 to 1,200 times. In that playlist, Skiles shares the voices and faces of veterans as they read and respond to passages from Lieutenant Colonel David Grossman's book, On Killing, The Psychological Costs of Learning to Kill in War and Society, which Skiles read while receiving treatment at an inpatient PTSD clinic in Northern California called the Gateway House. By first reading a passage aloud from the book for the camera, and then offering his or her own perspective on that passage, 12 veterans of Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam, and Kosovo bring Grossman's research to life. When, for example, Grossman writes about how citizens today are mostly insulated from death, our meat is prepackaged, for example, medicine prolongs life, mortuaries take care of the dead. So when Grossman is writing about how we're mostly insulated from death, Iraq veteran Jose Arias reflects on how death is treated in war, discusses how, quote, our honor code prevented us from talking about it, and suggests that, quote, we create the bubbles we want to live in. When Grossman cites the term operant conditioning from B.F. Skinner's work, Iraq veteran Mac Butler follows up by talking about what had become natural from his training, military training, and relating an experience from combat. He talks about the path of least resistance and the power of automatic as if instinctual response, as if it's just an instinct that you would act this way, which is the result of training. In another passage read by Skiles, Grossman uses the term combat exhaustion to describe a scenario in which the current physical and logistical ability to sustain combat outstrips human psychological capacity to endure it. Grossman notes that never before have troops had to stay in such a continual state of fight or flight, and seldom did they experience such high levels of imminent personal risk without respite. In response to this passage, Skiles tells us that in his first 2 weeks in country in 2003, he got 11 total hours of sleep. So, divide 11 by 14. A point about sleep deprivation echoed by Javier Juarez, a veteran of Kosovo and Iraq. He says, when I came back and I would tell people I didn't sleep for a year, physically you might have, but even then your brain didn't. End quotes. The vigilance in danger has been so extreme in some cases that, as Iraq veteran Erwin Lazo puts it in the film, quote, in a sense, you have to play like you're dead already. And he talks about how they'd be hit by mortars and it would happen, and you're supposed to put on your gear, and it would happen so many times that they'd just be like, oh, fuck it, you know. They wouldn't put on their protective gear. So, and Lazo in the film says, you know, in a sense, you have to play like you're dead already. And he says that this is a practice that he sees extending into veterans' post-war lives as well. So at home in the U.S., sitting on their front porch, two veterans not identified by name in the film tell us that the effects of such service aren't as noticeable until you get out, and quote, until you get out and maybe are a civilian. I think it's been promoted, like I think in the military it's better to be wound up and uptight. So shifting mindsets and coming to terms with the ways in which a military may commit what Grossman calls psychological warfare upon its own troops. Coming to terms with that, Iraq veteran Tazia Flores responds, "It's much like in basic training," she says. When you do say kill, 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 it's just another word. But reading this book, I see how it can affect people, you know, like learning that kill is not a bad word to knowing, like, yes it is, and it has a profound ripple effect, not only on my life or the person that was affected by it, but their family, you know, their community. End quote. And collectively, the personal reflections and real responses to Grossman's work captured in Skiles' documentary speak to the larger psychological and moral context of war and post-traumatic stress, which now seems like too plain a word, stress. The documentary teaches us that veterans' issues coming home from one or multiple deployments are not pinned to individual defect or aberration. And in fact, no vet is alone in feeling the mind-body effects of a military's systematic, years-in-the-making training apparatus. And in this way, Skiles' work is humane, powerful, and humbling. So, as we know, people in this room know, working at Wayne State, part of coming home for many veterans includes going to college on the post-9/11 GI Bill or with the assistance of vocational rehabilitation benefits. And many universities and colleges, our own included, have now earned yellow ribbon and military-friendly designations, achievements that not only enhance recruitment and retention of veteran students and their families, but also warrant discussion of how to continually follow through on the promises of those labels. Humbled by the sort of responsiveness to academic work generated in Skiles' film, professionals in higher ed realize that veterans in our classes are not 18-year-old freshmen. And I use that word intentionally. You know, they may be first-year students, but they're not freshmen. And may have very different orientations to schooling, to the institution, and to assigned material than their peers, so-called peers, with whom we are more accustomed to working. Moreover, since first-year writing classes are almost universally required for graduation, often with small class sizes and one-on-one feedback, writing specialists recognize that we especially need to be prepared to work with growing numbers of veterans and their family members who may wish to draw directly on military experience in the educational context. We have an abiding interest in the intrinsically compelling aspects of veterans' writing as a literature and as a mirror onto cultural conditions. And we also have what Past 4C's chair, Marilyn Valentino, and that's the organization that writing teachers in colleges are all kind of part of, what the chair of that organization has called an ethical obligation to react responsibly to veterans in the classroom. So thus far within my field, a first wave of composition research has emerged, which is comprehensive in scope. The body of research focuses, for example, on the empirical reality of college writing contexts that affect veteran students, the import of creative writing for veterans' transition to civilian life, the impact of trauma and signature wounds on writing and learning. Oh, and typically signature wounds are thought of as PTSD and traumatic brain injury, TBI. And the work of veterans writing groups, which are sometimes held on college campuses, are facilitated by those with academic ties, such as myself. So this very robust body of research has started to emerge, I would say, since 2009, maybe 2008. And the primary tenor of that research has been vigorous in its support of veteran students, as you'd imagine. Thorough, very thorough in its representation of veteran writers, yet more varied in its level of self-conscious engagement with the ideological dimensions of veterans' writing and self-representation. So that's sort of where I come in. And this is a common academic construction to say, like, the research has done X and Y, but it doesn't do Z, and so I'm going to do Z. And I don't mean to misrepresent the body of research that's there and point out a gap. But people are a little more cagey about talking about some of the things I'm going to bring up later, about some of these what I call ideological dimensions, meaning the heart and soul kinds of stuff, the do I believe in war or not, like what do I do when I'm having this conflict in values. So people have a harder time talking about those things. It's easier to quantify and to look around and point to resource centers. It's harder to deal with some of the more messy ideological matters, and that's what I'm trying to take on in this work. So at play in that variation, why is that the case? There may be an assumption that those who occupy institutional advocacy positions are better served by an amiable neutrality, which would hypothetically remove obvious agenda and open the door to deeper interpersonal relationships with vets. So you don't want to march in the door wearing like your Iraq Veterans Against the War t-shirt or something like that, because that would sort of color things oddly, perhaps. So that might be one assumption, that you want to maintain a neutrality in order to develop deeper interpersonal relationships. And another assumption may be that any criticism of the U.S. military, especially any criticism that is based in anti-war sentiment, would be received as relatively incompatible with a pro-veteran stance. How do you be against the war but for the troops? Elizabeth Samet points out in that article I quoted from at the beginning that there is some inherent kind of contradictions or difficulties in a statement like that. And so that's one of the things I grapple with. So in higher education generally, I would say overall, many have lingering anxieties about the depth of commitment required when working with veterans, and about where to draw lines between activist, supporter, teacher, and friend. And I saw Brian Turner, if you all know the war poet, started out as a war poet Brian Turner, who wrote Here Bullet. I saw him give a talk a couple years ago, and he said, you know, when you're in your office and you're working with a veteran, and he or she tells you some stuff, you know, this relationship may be a lifelong relationship. That may be the beginning of a lifelong relationship. And I know that some of us who have begun to work with vets, it's like once you start, there's no going back. There's no way that you can ignore some of the things once you become aware. So people have anxieties about where to draw lines between, as I said, activist, supporter, teacher, friend. In particular, questions may include the following. And so here are just 3 questions that I've heard lots of times. Number 1, how can a civilian, and I would say maybe even a non-combat vet, how can a civilian or non-combat veteran faculty member who hasn't, quote, been there, possibly understand or imagine or relate to the experience of deployment, war, and homecoming? Wouldn't it be better to keep our mouths shut and maybe place certain topics off limits? So you hear that a lot, like I couldn't imagine. You can't imagine. You can't imagine. Number 2, how might a veteran or a civilian on campus reconcile pride in military identity with some of the darker aspects of military experience, such as veteran suicide and military sexual trauma? So with regard to veteran suicide, I know some of you probably saw yesterday, the numbers are like 22, 23 per day. 22 or 23 veterans per day choose to take their own life. Military sexual trauma is referring to rape and sexual assault within the military. Both men and women can be survivors of military sexual trauma. So those are some dark aspects of military experience. How do you reconcile that with great pride in military identity at the same time? And number 3, don't faculty members need to be therapists to work with veterans or family members of veterans who want to talk about their experiences as such? And I've heard that a number of times, like, well, I'm not a therapist, I'm not qualified. You better watch out. If it is increasingly clear, as Professor Joyce Goldberg wrote in a 2011 column detailing a military history course she taught, in which she felt overwhelmed by the demands of veteran students and their families. If it is clear, she said, just how underprepared universities are to deal with the needs of these students and their student veterans and their relatives, then how do we get prepared? Whose job is it to, quote, deal? And I think that's a very unfortunate phrasing, the deal with, as if it's a problem. And my colleague Roger Thompson has written about the need to move away from a deficit model when it comes to working with veterans and trainings on veterans. So that a lot of the trainings will be about PTSD and about TBI and focus on those, or what to do if you have a problem with a veteran, rather than focusing on the many strengths, maturity, discipline, worldliness, knowledge of world affairs, all the wonderful strengths that veterans bring to a campus are sometimes sort of not talked about because the focus is on the more sensational. So how do we get prepared? If you say you got to be a therapist to do this, and you say, well, and this is following the work of Paula Kaplan in a book she wrote called When Johnny and Jane Come Marching Home. She says, listen, there aren't even enough therapists out there probably on campuses to work with all the veterans that we have. And in addition, she makes the argument that it can be further marginalizing to people to say, sorry, I can't talk to you. You're so messed up that I can't even relate to you. Like, it eliminates or it brackets a human connection. And there are responses to that as well, to say, like, so it's a lot of back and forth and messy issues, as I'm saying, these ideological issues. So those are 3 questions. The first, like, I couldn't possibly imagine thing. And then second, how do we reconcile pride with some more problematic aspects of military experience? And third, don't we need to be therapists? Like, how do we get prepared? Whose job is it to do this? Right? So what follows? I demonstrate, or I seek to demonstrate, how, and by the way, this is the part of the paper that is most new and I'm most working on, so see what you think. I hope to demonstrate that how a rhetoric of witnessing can be useful for addressing those questions. As an approach to veterans writing that comes from the perspective of composition studies and community writing groups, this rhetoric offers no easy answers or innocent positions. Rather, this rhetoric encourages readers, writers, listeners, and speakers to stand in observation of veterans' work long enough to hold their anxieties, contradictions, and competing points of view in suspense, right? Staying present in a potentially conflicted conversation about the effects of war on us all. So it's a funny thing to say, because I'm not going to answer these questions and solve these problems. I'm going to present a method or a rhetoric that allows us to hold the contradictions in suspense, as if in the air, allowing sort of both perspectives to be in tension with one another. Because truth be told, I'm not sure some of these things can be resolved once and for all. I think it's a matter of ongoing dialectical engagement. And by that I just mean conversation and awareness, moving toward. But I don't think it's like any magic bullets. So, specifics then, if we're able to do that, to hold these things in tension in our minds and our complex formations, I think then specifics regarding who can speak with most authority about war, when conversations about military experience are appropriate and welcome, what being a veteran or a civilian signifies in our time, why violence seems so attractive or inevitable or abhorrent, and where to look for truth and support for the living. Those things can then be accessed through a connection with veterans' writing and self-representation that is more informed, sensitive, and sustained. So this is now this concept of witnessing. So this idea of witnessing came to me first 6 years ago when I started working with warrior writers, and it was in response to my own concerns over my qualifications and my right to work with this organization. Having no great family history with the military or knowledge of wartime experience when I began. Drawing the term witness from Warrior Writer's mission statement. I first conceptualized witness as being a witness to, like being an observer, and took on the role of quiet observer. This ostensibly passive stance allowed me to actively focus on the role of the self and carve out time to come to terms with my own position in the complex formation of veterans representing war and peace. At an early workshop, for example, when a former Marine offered the word chains as a writing prompt, I thought, what do I, a civilian, having lived a life of relative safety, have to say about chains? And I composed the following response, which I have shared in other settings, but repeat here as an origin story that set in motion my current focus on the ideological dimensions of working with vets. So I wrote, chains. Ever since I moved to the North Country, that was upstate New York where I was at the time, I have been collecting bits of printed matter related to the war and its aftermath, or perhaps I should say its ongoing math. My collection is like one of those paper chains we made when we were kids, each person's little strip hooking on to the next. A Sesame Street themed booklet for kids whose parents are deployed, taken from a kiosk at the Watertown Mall. An Ottawa newspaper with a front page headline, "No Peace for Vets." The Cardarazzi officer told me when I told him I took a year of Arabic. The half-assed note written by an Air Force recruiter as an excuse for Sarah, my student, to go take her ASVAB. The Freeport drum paper I snagged at Valero, the gas station, while the guy in front of me bought a case of Old Mill at 7:45 in the morning. There's so many more little pieces I could add to this chain, including the pages we are all making right now. When the Veterans Writing Task Force tries to tie yellow ribbons around the trees next month, this was for Veterans Day, I want them to tie these paper chains instead. Some of us don't care for yellow ribbons unless they end war. So as the last of the pens stopped moving, after that, each of the participants read aloud what we had written, me going last. And when it was time for the next prompt, my co-organizer, Iraq veteran Nathan Lewis, offered, "Dear Veterans Task Force," as a response to my words. As both Lewis and I were members of that task force at the time, his graceful gesture made it clear that like links in a chain, our variable positionalities are tied together, yoked. And I believe it is the quality of these connections that lies at stake as universities wake up to the increasing presence of veterans on campus. Research can quantify things like funding for veterans programs, square footage for resource centers, and ours, by the way, has just doubled here at Wayne State, job openings for support professionals, and trainings for faculty and staff. Harder to quantify and impossible to mandate is the nature of beliefs, attitudes, and values towards, by, and among veterans. That is, those are ideological matters that take shape within the efforts. For so many years now, writes Iraq veteran Drew Cameron, the wars waged by our country have influenced our daily rituals, our mourning consciousness. For some, the recognition is very close to home. For all of us, though, war as it does continues to pressure the very fabric of our culture and worldview. Have we not all become veterans of war then? It is this very question of responsibility, of openness and honesty that reveals the essence of conflict and how it shapes our collective lives. When someone says, "I cannot know what it was like over there," we want them to. When someone says, "I can't imagine how it must have been," we need them to. When someone says, "I cannot," they must. I repeat this quotation every chance I get, as the imperative of Cameron's call here, his provocation, and the question of responsibility led me to step beyond my initial idea of witnessing as watching and recalling any direct experience that would implicate me in this scene of veterans writing, and move into what Oliver describes as a second side of witnessing, one which may be more useful for negotiating the ideological tensions discussed above. So, in Witnessing and Testimony, Oliver argues that witnessing is a double-sided term. On one hand, witnessing retains the sense of being an eyewitness to historical facts and actual events, as in its juridical use, like in a courtroom. On the other hand, witnessing for Oliver includes the sense of bearing witness to some truth about humanity and suffering that transcends those facts. And that's a quote. Bearing witness to some truth about humanity and suffering that transcends those facts. So the notion of seeing with one's own eyes what went on over there is paired with the notion of testifying to that which cannot be seen, bearing witness. And it is this realm of the unseen, what Oliver calls, quote, witnessing beyond recognition, where we may fully absorb Cameron's non-literal question, have we not all become veterans of war then? Applied to veterans writing, witnessing is about more than getting together and telling stories of what happened in the most literal sense. Witnessing involves telling some truth that touches the lives of everyone. For example, in a poem from Warrior Writer's third anthology, Nathan Lewis, my co-organizer, writes, "If things were the other way around, 20-year-old Iraqi soldiers would write home to girlfriends about the cold New York winters, about watching snow blow from frozen lakes. A captain would stand under a tall pine in Appalachia and call home to Baghdad on a satellite phone. He tried to be cheerful and tell them about skunks, hummingbirds, and mountains. Children would scribble the number and type of every enemy vehicle in crayon. Iraqi soldiers would take re-enlistment orders under the St. Louis Arch in the shadow of the Washington Monument. 200 protesters marched down Haifa Street, demanding an end to the war." In this poem, Lewis draws on what he has seen as an eyewitness to war to paint a picture that does not exist, yet speaks truth about human suffering, the waning innocence of children, the split consciousness of a nation. With this act of witnessing, Lewis opens up an imaginative space where we can move beyond what Oliver calls, quote, the melancholic choice between either dead historical facts or traumatic repetition of violence. The writing turns things around, remakes the common sense of war. And in this remaking, I think, lies the power of witnessing to bring us beyond a state of stale relations, hollow platitudes, and fear on all sides. For example, when Ivan Lopez opened fire at Fort Hood in April of this year, injuring 16 people and killing 4, including himself, Iraq veteran John Turner wrote a letter to several newspapers offering his condolences to the family members and underscoring the reality of PTSD, which had been, in many people's view, not fully recognized as a factor in Lopez's actions. So in this letter, Turner draws on both sides of the act of witnessing. So I'm trying to just give another example here. Titling the letter, Many Faces of War. Turner turns his own face to the light, sharing lived experience and testifying to his own trauma, as he then moves into a discussion of war's intergenerational, transnational, and vicarious effects. So here goes the letter. And I'm going to read almost the whole thing because I don't know how to really edit it down. But it's pretty short. So he says, Dear Editor, first and foremost, I offer my greatest condolences to the family members of those who were part of the tragedy at Fort Hood this week, including Ivan Lopez. As a two-time veteran of the Iraq War in 2005 and 2006, as an infantryman with the Marines, as well as being a Purple Heart recipient for a minor shrapnel wound, and I do not think it was minor, but he says a minor shrapnel wound, and having been diagnosed with severe post-traumatic stress and 2 traumatic brain injuries, I must depict my own unhealthy emotions that have arisen from the response to this past week's shooting by the officials who have publicly made claims that PTSD is not an issue. In 2007, as an alcoholic who underwent 2 rehab treatments before the age of 22, because the only way I could deal with my deployments was by staying drunk, I was discharged from Camp Lejeune and into the civilian populace who had an even lesser understanding of war, the effects of war, or the impact of post-traumatic stress. So with witnessing, it's the literal experience, the direct experience, and then it's the transcendent. And so he gives us the literal, the direct, and then he now moves into what I said was the intergenerational, the transnational, the vicarious effects of war, that are things that can affect everyone beyond his own specific embodied experience. So he says, we, as veterans of all generations, are trained to go to war and to undergo extreme conditions that have a lasting effect on the psyche. Iraq has been occupied for over 11 years now. Over 2 million troops have flown in and out of theater. Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed, and 22 veterans a day are killing themselves. I was fortunate enough to have been introduced to a small veteran population in Vermont who believed in alternative methods to what was and continues to be provided in attempts to reduce the symptoms of PTSD. But the reality is, many of us will not find a healthy outlet. For the past 7 years, I have traveled the country working with veterans by utilizing creative writing and artistic expression to make sense of the triggers, dreams, behaviors, and methodology that we have adapted since we returned home. Having worked with hundreds of veterans, having heard many sides to many stories, having seen the impact war has had on those who have served as well as their family members spanned over several generations in times of conflict, I can and always will say that regardless as to whether or not we saw death, touch the hearts and minds as we are intended to do, or whether we drove trucks and served for only 4 months overseas, and this was the case of Lopez. He had been deployed for 4 months and drove a truck, so people were doubting the role of PTSD, like how could he have sustained that if he was only there for 4 months, kind of a thing. So Turner refers to that. And he says, regardless of all of that, well, whatever we did, PTSD is real and has the potential and ability to rub off on those around us and leave anyone who was exposed to war and trauma in a state of confusion. My hopes are that those who have served in times of peace and in times of war will be willing to recognize that there may be underlying issues that have contributed to their behaviors since either returning home or leaving the military, and that those who have sent us off to war, regardless if we volunteered or were drafted, that those will be willing to let themselves be humbled and offer a solution to this epidemic that has infected our soldiers, their families, the quote enemy, and the lands upon which we live. In peace, JT. So I take seriously, so now I'm thinking I really should have cut that down because that was long. But I take seriously Turner's, Turner's, 's, 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 ' And I suggest that looking to veterans' writing and self-representation may be one way to add nuance to dominant narratives, to discover perspectives unseen previously, and to come to terms with one's own position in a post-war era of continuing violence. Indeed, words that were used as a postscript to the book Free Fire Zone, published by Vietnam Veterans Independent Press some 40 years ago, echo throughout an act of witnessing. Now you have heard it, they say. What happened is part of you too. Practicing a rhetoric of witnessing, then, I am no longer able to hold veterans at arm's length, denying responsibility or hoping that some other part of the university will, quote, deal with veterans and their relatives. We are those relatives, if not by blood, then by kinship in other forms. Thank you.
There's ample time for questions, comments, reactions.
Hi, yes.
Hi. As a veteran, and not a combat veteran to be specific, but of combat arms, I was a combat engineer, front lines, never thankfully had to take a bullet or get one. I think you're doing great work.
Thank you.
And I think you make the perfect point that regardless, we all have to make that transition. And one of the things that happens is you're put in a situation in college where now you're being asked to express your feelings on a certain topic, and really your only thought is of your experiences in service. So my first couple of semesters of college, that's all I knew to write. And you know, it all comes out when you're put in that situation. Someone asks you to give you that feedback. So I think not only do we have to be prepared for that, but you know, it's gonna have to be acknowledged some way or another. You know, by either saying to a person, "Thank you for your service," and just giving that much to reflect that you've read their thoughts, and that you can say to them, you know, "Thank you." At least that's something. You know, you don't have to be able to put yourself in the shoes of a combat situation to understand what that does to someone, and to just tell them that you care, that they're willing to share that with you. I think that's big of all of us if we have that opportunity to do it. So thanks again for what you do.
So did you find like your experience were pretty well received as a student, or what was your experience when you were trying to like adjust?
Oh, I'm still adjusting. Yeah. You know, everyone's transition is different. Everyone's service is different. If I'm working with a student and they're, you know, a Coast Guard veteran, I don't assume to know what their service was, but I'd ask them and try to make some sort of sense out of it, try to apply it to their studies here at the university. But my own transition and what that is to me is ongoing. It was harder in those earlier days, and it's something I always have to reflect back on. And I think like you mentioned, it's continual. You know, just being put in the mindset of combat arms was difficult for me to deal with. I never even had to do it, but to me that was enough to know that it was changing me.
Yeah.
And that's the thing about being a transitioning veteran. Everyone has their own, even if it's just coming from that culture to this culture, that's
Right.
enough of a transition for anybody.
Right.
That it's going to take them time, and depending on where they are in that period of time, it's going to be a different reaction. You know, so.
Yeah. colleague who is a spouse of a Marine veteran who never deployed or anything, but had PTSD from basic training in the Marines.
Yeah, that's what, and you pointed that out with some of the writing that you had, Bill. That was that was something that I got out of the service and I had to wean off of doing. You know, somebody'd say something I like, I'd kill.
Yeah.
You know, eyes big at me. I'm just sorry. I like what you're saying.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, I was fortunate enough to see Benjamin Bush, who's a Iraq veteran writer in the English department last Friday. He gave a talk. He read some of his work, and he told a story of being in basic training. He was a Marine, and there was a line from some movie. It's like, what color is the grass, or what makes the grass green? And it's like, blood, blood, blood. And he said it like even stronger than me, and he immediately flipped in the presentation, flipped into that, and it was like, whoa. And then he said, how's everybody doing? To bring it back down. So like that notion of in Grossman's book that that documentary is based on, they talk a lot about that, about this training apparatus. And a vet can get out and come home and be like, what's wrong with me? You know, and it's not conditioned to seek help. You know, if you seek help, maybe you're taking resources away from your buddy who needs it more, that kind of thing. And so there can be like isolation. And then you can layer on top of that, and this is something I just read yesterday, all the stuff coming out with Veterans Day, about if you layer on top of that the rhetoric of being a hero, then heroes are kind of stoic. Heroes sort of like can man up, or as my colleague Alexis Hart says, woman up, and not let any cracks show. You know what I mean? So coming from that mentality, and then being in a situation where it's very possible and probable that you would need some support and help, and not being able to seek that out, it's very difficult, I think. And to your point about you don't have to be able to walk in a veteran's shoes. There's or boots, maybe. There's this concept of that Iris Marion Young, who's a political philosopher, has called asymmetrical reciprocity. So asymmetrical, like not the same, not symmetrical, and reciprocity, you know, the back and forth. This idea that any two people are going to have radical differences between them, even a veteran and a veteran. As you said, Coast Guard veteran, I don't know what your experience is, tell me about it. So there can be a false assumption that if there's a bunch of vets, they all are gonna like know what's up with each other, you know, and as may or may not be the case, you know. So Matt Gallagher, who is a veteran writer with the organization Words After War, he has a blog in the New York Times, the At War blog. He has come out and with some articles saying like it's really important for veterans writing groups to have civilians in them, because there are some people who say there should be veterans only, safe space, that kind of a thing. Because no, it's very important to have civilians in the groups, because veterans can start to draw a curtain around themselves, you know, and say, oh, nobody else can possibly understand. You weren't there, you don't know. So he thinks it's important to open that up so that civilians can provide a little bit of a reality check in some ways, and can also help improve the writing by providing an audience who doesn't necessarily know all these acronyms and all this jargon, who needs clarification and elaboration. And so that is one way I've thought through that question of like, how could I possibly understand, and also what right do I have to even go there? And even today, like when you said at first, like, you're doing good work, you know, whatever, like you gave me your approval, I was like, oh my God. Because I still have that anxiety of being a civilian talking about these things, even with, you know, 6 years or whatever experience, that I actually don't know what I'm talking about, and I should just, you know, shut the front door, you know. So, yeah.
Karen, I have a field-specific question for you within composition studies, which is, as you were talking, I was thinking about other extracurricular, you know, kind of a writing group model, you know, and some of the ways in which some of those groups have come to reclaim the curriculum in different ways. I'm thinking about feminist pedagogies, disability studies pedagogies, LGBT pedagogies, and so on and so forth. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the Warriors Writing Project and in terms of moving into mainstream curriculum and composition studies, the way some of these other groups have done, or is the purpose of the group best served through extracurricular, like a writing project?
Yeah, that's a question that has come up before too. So is the model one that we could take into, say, a veterans cohort first year writing class, where they get their first year writing credit out of the way, so to speak, through this kind of a model, where they're with other vets and they're writing about service, and they're learning academic modes of writing, organization, citation, all the things you would expect people to learn in a writing class. But it's focused on military experience. Now, some universities have done that. So Colorado State, for example, has done that. And they've had some success with it. They've had trouble with registration, all the bureaucratic logistics and all that stuff. But they've had some success in terms of the unit cohesion, so to speak, of the veterans in the class. Now, with Warrior Writers, it is a nonprofit organization that was had originally taken shape within the context of Iraq Veterans Against the War. Iraq Veterans Against the War was then sort of, not defunded, but they lost a lot of funding and they could no longer maintain this Warrior Writers aspect of it, and so it branched off and it's now an independent organization. Lavella Kalika is the project leader and has been just instrumental, an amazing woman, Lavella. So it's a space for healing, it's a space for community building, it's a space where you aren't judged for what you write, and so to move that into the academic model becomes a little bit difficult because you have to assign grades and credit, stuff like that. So I think it's best to sort of keep the two apart, but perhaps complementary, because I've met a number of students in the context of the writing classes that I teach in the at the university who are veterans, who I then say, hey, do you want to come to this group? Do you want to come? And sometimes I sort of like bring them to come, and sometimes they'll come and just sit and sort of be like, what is this? Because it's kind of like hippie-ish, it's kind of touchy-feely sometimes, because everything's okay. You can say whatever's on your mind, and you don't have to say anything. If you cry, it's okay. If you need to leave the room and somebody goes with you, that's fine. So it's a different sort of an environment, and my position in institutions of higher ed sort of gives me access to rooms and to photocopiers and to books, and so I leverage that in order to run the workshops. But I think if it became a 4-credit thing, it really would maybe taint the sort of non-judgmental healing parts of it.
What about at Wayne State? There's a lot of focus on learning communities out of the provost's office.
Oh yeah.
Have you considered that, or has the Veterans Center
Yeah, so
considered
the
that?
Vet Pack. Can you talk about Vet Pack?
Sure. So in the past, we have tried a traditional learning community, and one of the difficulties that we ran into immediately was that with the learning community, you're bringing together some cohort of students, some common experience or like-minded or situation that these students have. With veterans, it's such a diverse group that just having a veterans learning community alone didn't really mean much.
Right.
So what we did was we tried a different approach to a learning community. We tried call it an e-learning community only because we were using the technologies, but what we tried to do was divide the groups into academic interests, areas of interest. So as broad as possible, but still meaningful. So veterans in the health sciences, or veterans in the arts, and engineering, business, things like that. So we did break these groups out, and it's still an ongoing process of making it work because there isn't a whole lot of precedent for that type of arrangement. And the other side of it too is that with veterans, the majority of the veterans that we have as students here, we have 600 plus student veterans at the university. The majority of them are veterans in transition. And what I mean by that is they went straight from service time right to university.
Right.
They had very little time for transition between. And so some of the programming, some of the groups of that nature, it's difficult to get buy-in early on. So during the first year or two, a lot of our veterans aren't as interested in participating in those types of activities until later, their junior or senior year. Or if we're getting them as transfer students, they're coming in, they're adjusting to our campus. So it can be a challenge, but it is something that we're working on. Now, what the veterans have done though is on their own, they've formed their own informal community. I mean, we do have a very, very robust student veterans organization, and we do have, as Karen mentioned, the Student Veterans Resource Center inside the Student Center building. But you put veterans together, it doesn't matter what era, it doesn't matter what branch, they have that camaraderie that's just built into it, and they've formed their own community on campus. And what we've seen was at the front end, what it's used for is a transition point, a point of transition. Whether it's the physical space on campus inside the Resource Center, or whether it's the structure of the Student Veterans Organization as an outlet for continuing a mission, because what they're really focused on is community service. So it gives them a new mission of community service, or whatever they're focused on at that given time is there. But quickly we see that once they have that, having that safe place, having that organization, that they do successfully transition and do assimilate into the university population as a business student now, as a law student, and they get into those other groups that are less military centered and more into just the general populations. So, you know, it was when I first started working with veterans at the university 10 years ago, we were losing our student veterans at a rate of about 50% within their first year at the university, most of them within the first semester. And when we first looked at the issue, it seemed to be that it was just an academic issue. Maybe these students had been out of the classroom 4 years, 8 years, 12 years, and they weren't academically prepared, and that's what the problem was, because you just look at raw data like grades. That wasn't the problem. It wasn't the problem. When you look deeper, when you went into the underlying layers, it was transition issues. That's what the big problem was. So if a student wasn't attending class because they had transition issues that were keeping them from getting up in the morning and making that drive, that's not an academic issue. That's something completely different. On paper, it looks like it because they're failing their classes or they're getting, you know, insufficient grades. But it was transition. And, you know, just to be honest, most schools nationwide, they just don't get it. They just haven't. They either don't see the need because veterans are such a small part of their overall population. I mean, you know, less than 1% of Americans will ever wear a uniform in any capacity. So they just don't see that there's a need to focus so much energy and efforts on such a small group. Or they just don't have the resources themselves to dedicate services. Right. So, you know, what it comes down to though is that all of these service members have been given the promise, they were guaranteed educational benefits so that when they left the military, they could go to school for free. But that's it. That promise was made, the benefits are there, that pool of money is sitting there waiting for them to use, but it does nothing to address transitional services. It does nothing to address those academic support, you know, services that they need, or the campus support services that they need to help them to be academically successful. I mean, fortunately, we're at a university that does get it, And many, many years ago, they put into place programs and services, and they've been continuously supportive of us as the face of veterans has changed. Because again, 15 years ago, we were in a very different situation with the student veteran that we are today, and that likely will continue to change 5, 10, 15 years from now. So we are very fortunate to be at an institution that is flexible enough to both be proactive and reactive at the same time. But honestly, most schools nationwide they just don't get it, or at the very least they haven't been given the opportunity to implement programming and supportive services. But learning communities absolutely are a great avenue, and whenever I have the opportunity to speak to other institutions that want to know what should we be doing, what's a best practice that you can suggest, learning communities are something that I bring up all the time.
It's interesting because we have a learning community in the English department that's actually attached to classes.
Yes.
And that's a model that can overcome some of those bureaucratic
Yes.
parts, like what we would call here special sections for
Right.
X, special sections for Y.
And that's what Karen was mentioning, Vet Pack program. What the Vet Pack program is something new. Kenya had just left, but Ryan, he's an academic advisor that works with the student veterans here. What they do is, at the point of admissions, we're given the opportunity to review applications for student veterans and service members and identify where there may be challenges that veteran is going to face transitioning into the university. So what we're able to do is to provide additional advising support services. So it's a more, what we call an intrusive academic advising experience, which means they're meeting with their academic advisor, be it in person or over the phone or on email once a week, every other week, but and also being willing to take straightforward advice. I mean, Ryan, he doesn't pull punches when he meets with these veterans. He makes sure that on day one, what are your strengths? What are you bringing to the table? Where are you at this point in your transition? And how are you going to translate that into academic success during your time here at the university? So the Vet Pack program has both the advising experience, and there's also an APEX study skills course that's attached to it. So it's a veteran section. And what we're hoping to do in the near future is to have boot camps for math and English. So if a student is identified as being less prepared to take that placement exam, or maybe if they're not coming in with sufficient transfer credit to place them at above the remedial level, that they could go through maybe a 2-week program where they spend the mornings doing an intense English prep and the afternoons doing a math prep. And then after the end of that 2-week period, they're better prepared to take that placement exam, or at the very least, even if they do end up in a remedial course, face it with confidence. And we're modeling that after a lot of the other programs that are out there for other cohorts of students. But part of the problem is, and this is just bureaucratic, that the way that VA educational benefits are structured is that you can't have veteran-only sections of courses and still be allowed to receive educational benefits. Something called the 85-15 rule, because once upon a time there were predatory schools that just wanted to grab up those GI Bill dollars. So they were, hey, you give us half your GI Bill, and in 12 months we'll give you a certificate. So you had 100% veterans in these sections, or schools that were popping up just to serve veterans. Well, there's still a carryover effect from that. So we have to be creative in the way that we do it to target those services to our veterans. So offering it within an existing course, but having seats set aside for veterans or something along those lines, or having some sort of, kind of like what honors does.
Yeah, there's a lot of models for that.
Sure.
Question is, what does the military do more here? It seems like they could extend the enlistment of the guy for 3 months and they could go to school and then get a discharge. It just seems like, I'm a Vietnam vet, and I just processed out of Oakland Army Base. There you are.
Yeah.
Seems like it's a failure of our military really to prepare veterans for transition.
Well, unfortunately for your generation, but that's the way it was where that was going on. My generation, coming from that to first Desert Storm to my generation now, They've changed a lot of the out processing that they do with veterans because of how badly your generation was treated, unfortunately. So there's, I mean, and that's not to say that they do enough, because you know they don't, but they do something. They make you have a psych eval. They make you go through a final physical. They make you go through basic civilian training, so that when you step out of boots and into shoes on the ground as a civilian for the first time in however many years, at least you know how, you know, supposedly it'll be when you get out.
Well, there are programs in place.
In military, yes, and then, but that is to say, when you step out of that week-long mandatory thing that they make you do, same thing that you've seen in your life, you know.
Seems like, you know, they could send you a base back in the States, and maybe you could start classes, and there's credit hours, and then, I don't know.
Something a little less abrupt.
Right.
Well, that's what I think that is so great about Wayne State, like Matt was saying, and the overall services that are available to veterans who are making their transition here, as opposed to another institution where maybe they're not getting any sort of veteran-specific services. And I know that because, you know, I'm in the community outside of Wayne State, and I'll talk to students that are in other institutions, and they can't believe the things that we're doing.
Yeah.
And you know, what do you mean you get this or that?
Yeah.
You know,
That
you
was
can
my
help me with
reaction,
this.
too.
Oh, it took me weeks. You know, or you know, at any rate, I think that we're doing something right here, and so you know that's.
Yeah, Pat would show me around it was showing me the Veterans Resource Center and being sort of like apologetic, like, oh yeah, we only have this, and I was thinking, this is incredible compared to places. I mean, we've only been 3 other places, but those places had nothing on Wayne.
I have a question. My brother was in the service, although he wasn't a combat veteran, and he was telling me about they had courses, like he was in community college at the Air Force,
Yes.
he took some classes. Now, do those kind of credits transfer, or are they part of the process, or is that what you were talking about, that they have difficulty transferring those credits?
Right.
Do they get degrees? Because he said he was taking it at California, University of California, and
Now-
I mean, how do they make those transitions, and do they get degrees while they're in the service?
Potentially. So depending on what your military specialty is, depending which branch of service, depending what time frame you're in, you have different opportunities. The Air Force is unique in that they have their own community college, the Community College of the Air Force. So when you're taking classes, they're based on, you know, curriculum that any other community college would offer. They're accredited, so it's an official community college. The other branches of service, though, what they'll do is they'll provide service members the opportunity for tuition assistance while they're in service, and then GI Bill, different iterations of GI Bill, once you leave service. But unfortunately, we talked about it a little bit earlier. Nowadays, what that tends to mean is that you have access to online courses, and not all online education is equal. And there isn't a whole lot of emphasis on getting the best academic bang for the buck out of it, as it is so much of what's the most flexible, what's the most accommodating, what's the easiest way for you to earn credit while you're in service. So, I mean, that's not to say that you can't still get a quality education while you're in the service using tuition assistance. You absolutely can, but the emphasis is more on schools that are willing to provide flexible online schedules that will work around your military service so that you can earn that credit. Because while you're in service, credit equals promotion points. So sometimes it's what's the path of least resistance to make that happen, more so than what's most academically advantageous for you. So it is possible, absolutely, to earn an associate's degree, to even go beyond that while you're in the military, but depending on what your nature of service is, it might be more difficult. It's kind of hard to do it if you're in a combat situation as opposed to if you're on a base, but it is absolutely possible, yes. And the credit that you do earn, it's transferable just like any other credit. Transfer credit evaluation evaluates it, and if it matches up with the curriculum that we have at here or at any institution, it's transferable. One thing that Wayne State does that's unique is that we automatically give transfer credit for military service. So just by virtue of the fact that you served, you went through basic training, you receive transfer credit. But it's elective. It doesn't necessarily fulfill any requirements. And then on top of that, all service members, again, regardless of when you served, what the nature of your service was, you've received constant training the entire time you were in the military. And that training is summarized on what they call now the Joint Services Transcript. So we do evaluate that JST as well for potential credit. So all of our service members are coming in essentially then as transfer students with typically about 16 credits towards graduation.
There's a question on course.
I was just gonna say, I got my master's degree while I was in the service.
Oh, okay.
From an online from the American Military University, and I thought it was an excellent education. Really writing intensive